This playlist gathers together and organizes the components of the lecture on Redcliffe's paper in sustainable development. We'll start off by talking a little bit about who Dr. Redcliffe is. I've got a picture of him. You can see sort of what this individual looks like, some of the things that he's done. And then we'll turn to the paper itself. Now, the paper itself, one of the sort of organizing themes is the emergence of distinct and potentially incompatible discourses about what sustained development is and how to achieve it. And so, in some ways, reading through the paper, I won't be surprised at all if students found it difficult to figure out what was really going on, what's important, where the paper was even going. And so I'm going to just pull out sort of one strand of narrative, basically. I'm going to talk specifically about the way in which sustainable development gets conceptualized, the way in which the problem that sustainable development is supposed to be a response to is conceptualized through the time period, including up until 2015, so beyond the actual paper itself. So we'll start with that original Brundtland concept of sustainable development, which, as Redcliffe notes, is a notion of sustainable development that's rooted in meeting the current and future needs of human beings, where any concerns about whether or not that can be done are sort of rooted in a notion of temporary technological or organizational societal limitations, as opposed to limitations about the nature of the planet itself. Then we'll look at the sort of next stop on this historical road towards the present, Agenda 21, which was the Rio Agreement. 21 is the code for Rio, and that's why it's called Agenda 21. And we'll look at how the conception of the problem itself is dramatically different in that period of just 5 years. And we'll look at the sort of incongruous elements of the understanding of the solution. And so we'll look at the original, upfront statement that talks about how sustainable development is going to result in increased standards of living for everyone. It will address social ills and eliminate environmental degradation, and it'll do so by sort of cooperative interaction. So a sort of neoliberal market-driven approach. And then we'll look at the overall structure of Agenda 21, which breaks down the goals and the way in which the goals would get implemented into 4 different categories. And those don't look a lot like neoliberalism, at least on the surface. But they also mark a movement towards conceptualizing what sustainable development is supposed to create for not just individuals, but the world at large. Then we'll look at the paper from 1993, just a year later, basically, by Daly and Townsend. The criticism that is part of the name of Redcliffe's paper, that sustainable development is an oxymoron. And we want to see how they actually frame it, and we'll look at a very brief argument they present for it, because it's their presentation is actually quite compelling. And it represents, as Redcliffe notes, a moment in time where there's a sort of beginnings, at least, of a disillusionment with the idea that somehow market forces and innovation will eventually solve these problems. In fact, it represents a pretty cynical view of that possibility. And it marks a sort of turning point from conceiving of sustainable development in terms of meeting human needs to conceiving of sustainable development in terms of rights, responsibilities, social justice, and so on. And so the next stopping point on our road to the future will be that declaration of human responsibilities. And we'll see that we begin to see a real emphasis in thinking about sustainable development on what it is that the world is supposed to look like as a result of sustainable development, and what it is that the world is supposed to look like gets framed in terms of rights, responsibilities, justice, and equality. And we'll see this really clearly in the 2030 Agenda, which was a non-binding agreement that was put together in 2015 that articulates what the goals are, 17 of them, for all nations that are supposed to be accomplished within this time frame of 2016 and 2030. And so we'll look at that. And then we'll end by sort of thinking about what happened to the Dali and Townsend stuff. So there's a lot of thought that's gone into our conception of what society should look like and how sustainable development should pan out for individual nations and individual people. But the contradiction that they bring to the forefront, we'll want to look and see and think about whether that's been developed in any way, shape, or form to nearly the extent that the notion of what our society ought to look like has been. So this is Michael Radcliffe. He's currently an emeritus, means he's retired but still holds an honorary position, professor of international environmental policy in the Department of Geography at King's College London. He spent most of his time, most of his career anyway, at the Imperial College at Way. And he was also the first director of the Global Environmental Change Program of the ESRC. He held that position between 1990 and 1995. He's a prolific researcher and writer, and one of his books that I would point to here is a book that's sort of mirroring the title of this paper, right? Sustainable Development, Exploring the Contradictions, that he published that very same year. So let's look then at that original 1987 concept of sustainable development. Now he gives you a quote that's the first sentence of this longer quote that I've lifted from the original document. So sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that's the quote that we get from our author there, Radcliffe. And he rightly points out that there is a framing of what it is to have sustainable development in terms of meeting present and future needs. But that gets elaborated in the next couple of sentences, right? Specifically, they talk about two key concepts that they think meeting sustainable development or understanding sustainable development involves. And I think it's instructive to look at those two key concepts. The first concept is the concept of needs. So what do they understand by needs? In particular, they say the essential needs of the world's poor, to which overriding priority should be given. So even as far back as 1987, there's a conception of inequality, of disparity in the distribution of wealth within the world that needs to be met. And there's an emphasis on essential or basic needs over other more, to use the term we get from the Singer article, luxury needs. The second key concept in this document is the idea of limitations imposed by the state of technology and social organization on the environment's ability to meet present and future needs. So there's this conception of what sustainable development is. It's meeting the needs of the present in a way that allows for people to meet their needs in the future. And there is this sort of suggestion that limitations are really sort of the transitory limitations imposed by the state of technology and social organization, and not limitations inherent to the environment itself, for instance.